In speaking of the art of creation, as there may be some ambiguity about the expression, I wish to say that my object is to consider by what process or method things are made to appear and exist in the world. This may seem a bold matter to discuss, but it has, of course, been the subject of philosophy time out of mind. 40 or 50 years ago, the materialistic view of the world was much in evidence. We all at that time were automatons, and it was the fashion to regard human beings as composed of enormous crowds of material atoms, by whose mechanical impacts all human actions were produced. And even certain mental phenomena, in the shape of consciousness, were evolved as a sort of byproduct. Since then, however, partly through a natural reaction and partly through the influx of Eastern ideas, there has been a great swing of the pendulum, and a disposition to posit the mental world as nearer the basis of existence, and to look upon material phenomena rather as the outcome and expression of the mental. In the later part of last century, we looked upon creation as a process of machinery. Today we look upon it as an art. Let us take our thoughts first. We have only to indulge in a few moments' rest, and immediately we become aware that our mind is peopled by a motley crowd of phantoms. We seem to see them springing up of themselves, and almost at random, from the background of consciousness. Images of scenes, the countenances of friends, concatenations of arguments and of events, an innumerable procession. Where does it all come from? Yet a moment more, and we see that the crowd is not a random one, but that it is inspired and given its form by the emotions, the feelings, the desires, lying deep and half-hidden within. We are depressed, and the forms and images that pass before us are those of disaster and fear. Or we are in high spirits, and the scenes are scenes of joy and gladness. This is familiar ground, of course, but it may be worthwhile considering it more in detail. Feeling, or desire, lies beneath. Thought is the form which it takes as it comes into the outer world. Let us take a definite instance. We desire to travel. The desire begins first as a mere vague sense of discomfort or restlessness. Presently it takes a shape as a wish to leave home or to visit other regions. It may remain at that for some time. Then it takes somewhat more definite shape, as to go to the seaside. Then we consult our wife. We consider ways and means. We fumble through Bradshaw. The thought of Margate comes as a kind of inspiration, and a quite distinct and clearly formed plan emerges. Or we wish to build ourselves a house of our own. For a long time this may be only a kind of cloudy, pious aspiration. But at last and almost inevitably, the dream of the house takes shape within our minds. We get so far as to make a pencil sketch of what we want. We go and prospect a site. We consult an architect. And presently there emerges a much more definite and detailed plan than before. Then steps are actually taken towards building. Heaps of bricks and stone and other materials begin to appear on the scene. And at last there is the house standing, which once only existed in the dream world of our minds. Always the movement is outwards, from the indefinite vague feeling or desire to the definite, clearly formed thought, and thence to action and the external world. Whatever feeling it is, the result is the same. We harbor within us the desire to injure anyone, or the desire to benefit anyone. The desire cannot remain at that stage. It must either perish away, or else if it is harbored, it will grow. It will grow into definite thoughts and plans of benefit or of injury. And these thoughts and plans will grow into actions. True, the actions may not be seen immediately. The thoughts and plans may work unseen for a long time. Still, there they are, working. There they are making ready the channels for action. And this it is, I suppose, which explains the fact that we all of us at times act so much more heroically than either our neighbors or even ourselves expect. And also I am afraid that at times we act so much more meanly. All the time in silence, thought has been busy within, making ready the channels. And so one day when a great rush of feeling comes, it flows down, and in an instant, as it were, before we have time to say yes or nay, has flung itself forth into our actions, and taken form and standing in the visible world. And not only is this true of violent feeling, that it finds expression in the visible world, but even of very quiet feeling the same, if it is also persistent. If so small a creature as man presses with his hand against the side of a great ship floating in dock, it seems that no result is produced. Yet we know that if he should continue persistently so to press, in time a measurable effect would ensue. And so it is with those smaller, calmer currents of desire and feelings within us. If they are always there, always flowing, they will inevitably show themselves in time. Gradually, insensibly, they modify our thoughts, our actions, our habits of action, the movements of our muscles and limbs, the expressions of our faces, the forms of our bodies, yes, even the forms of our bodies, the forms and outlines of our faces, our expressions and manners, and the tones of our voices. All the things that go to make up our appearance in the world are, I will not say entirely the result, since heredity and other things have to be considered, but plainly, to a very great extent, the result and expression of those dim feelings and emotions which, welling up in the hidden caverns of the mind, gradually press forward and outward into the light of day. So far, then, we seem to come upon something which we may call a law of nature, just as much as gravitation or any other law. The law, namely, that within ourselves there is a continual movement outwards, from feeling towards thought, and then to action, from the inner to the outer, from the vague to the definite, from the emotional to the practical, from the world of dreams to the world of actual things and what we call reality. It will be said, however, that though this general movement of feeling and thought towards the outer and real world may be truly noticed, yet there is an immense and everlasting difference between thoughts and actual things, between the sketch of the house in my mind and the actual house of stone and mortar. The one is a mere dream, an insubstantial phantom inside my brain, which no one but myself can see or feel. The other is a solid and undeniable fact, which would crack my skull and brain both, if they came into too sudden contact with it. Nevertheless, as I have shown that between a man's thoughts and his actions, there is no positive line of separation that can be drawn, so I want it to be realized as we go on, that the house as it exists in the man's brain, and the house as it stands on the hillside, are not two entirely separate things, that an essential unity enfolds them, and that the same art of creation which is concerned in the production of one is also concerned in the production of the other. But first I would say a word about dreams. I have pointed out that in our waking hours, continual processions of thoughts are passing through the mind, stimulated by underlying feeling. In the dreams of sleep, we notice the same ebullition of images. Only we say, and rightly, that they are more scrappy, more incoherent, more grotesque. The truth is, doubtless, that in sleep the higher reasoning centers of the brain are quiescent, and consequently the growth of images takes place more at random and less harmoniously. But what I want you to notice is that the same rule as before governs, and that the dream images are, for the most part, inspired or evoked by dim, underlying feelings. We go to sleep with insufficient covering on, and immediately dream of plunging through snowdrifts, or falling into a crevice. Or we have eaten a heavy supper, and are haunted by most discomfortable apparitions, which image and represent to us, in outward form, the discomfort we feel within, That hunger, or any other need or desire of the body, evokes illustrative dreams as a commonplace remark. A friend of mine in the interior of Africa years ago, with an exploring party, was for 8 days without food, nothing but a parrot and a mudfish having been obtained during that time. He said that one of the worst trials of the starvation was the impossibility of the sleep which it brought with it. And when, worn out with fatigue, he did relapse into slumber for a minute or two, it was only to be visited by a most tantalizing dream. For at once he beheld what he described as a most delicious dish of mutton cutlets floating towards him. Of course, no sooner did he stretch his hand to seize the prize than he woke, and the vision departed. But he said that if during those fateful days he dreamed of that blessed dish once, he dreamed of it 100 times. Here we see an almost poetic and artistic effort of the slumbering mind to express the underlying desire for food in the most lovely and attractive form which it could devise. And some folk who are of a literary turn are not unaccustomed to find themselves composing dream verses, which are expressive in their way, even if not perfect models of composition. An acquaintance of mine who was accustomed to keep a pencil and paper by his bedside for such occasions told me that he once woke in the night feeling himself drenched with a sense of seraphic joy and satisfaction, while at the same time a lovely stanza, which he had just dreamed, lingered in his mind. Quickly he wrote it down and immediately fell asleep again. In the morning waking, after a while he bethought himself of the precious experience, and turning to look at the words, which he doubted not would make his name immortal, he read, "Walker with one eye, walker with two, something to live for, and nothing to do." Here again we find that the deep feeling in which the sleeper's mind was drenched had got so far as to instinctively clothe itself in rhyme and rhythm. This, at any rate, was an important move in the direction of expression, even though the poetry produced was not of a very high order. Still, one must feel that the ideal of, quote, something to live for and nothing to do was a very blessed and beautiful one in its way. There is a class of dreams which occur not unfrequently under anesthetics, which are interesting because they illustrate this expressive symbolic quality. There is good reason to believe that under anesthetics there is a separation effected between the grosser material body and the more subtle and highly conscious part, a separation from the connection of pain and a liberation, so to speak, of the inner being. And it is curious that under anesthetics, dreams so frequently occur in which one seems to be flying or soaring through space with a great sense of joy and liberation. I have heard of many instances. The following rather poetic dream was told me by a friend as consequent on the somewhat prosaic operation of having a tooth removed under gas. He dreamed immediately that he was soaring through space, with an intense feeling of freedom and ecstasy. Up and up through the ethereal regions he went, till suddenly he popped out on the floor of heaven. And there, I suppose he had been reading Plato, he beheld the 12 gods seated in a semicircle, and filled, as gods should be, with inextinguishable joy and laughter. And well might they laugh, for now he became conscious of himself, there on the floor of heaven as a small transparent ball of jelly, in the center of which was a speck, which he knew to be his very self or ego. He also was greatly amused, and was just about to join in the laughter, when he heard behind him a horrible sound, as of the belling of a gigantic bloodhound, and a sense awful despair seized him, as he realized that his body, with its mouth wide open, was in pursuit of him. Escape was hopeless. There was a moment of agony as he was swallowed down, and then he woke up to find his tooth out. In a dream like this, though one cannot suppose it to be an accurate description or vision of what actually took place, Yet one may well suppose it to be an artistic representation of real facts and feelings, and an endeavor to portray them in the symbols and images of the world we know. Thus, what I want the reader to notice is that the operation of the mind in dreams is along similar lines to that of our waking hours, though naturally not quite so perfect. That is, it proceeds from underlying feeling to images and thoughts which represent the feeling, and which continually become more distinct and real. I need hardly say that I am not here giving a complete theory of dreams, for there may be some dreams that fall under other heads, but I am simply citing them in illustration of my principle. The tendency is, I say, for all these images evoked in our minds by feeling to grow on us and become more and more distinct and real. And indeed, in dreams, we wonder sometimes at the intense reality of the images we see. But it is really quite the same in waking life. We are walking down the street on some errand, but presently forgetting about our proper business, the mind wanders away just as in dreamland, and we imagine ourselves talking to some friend in Australia, or at the club arguing violently some question with an opponent. The scene grows more and more distinct, more real to us. We become quite lost in it, till suddenly we run against a lamppost. Then, of course, the dream is dissipated. Something more real than it has arrived. But in the dreams of sleep there is no lamppost, and so they go on gathering reality, till they seem as actual to us as the events of the outer world. The chief difference between the thoughts of our waking hours and those of sleep is that the former are constantly corrected and set in order by the presence of the actual world around us, whereas the visions of sleep grow undisturbed like plants in a hothouse, defended from the winds, or like weeds in a sheltered and neglected corner of the garden. That this is so is shown by the fact that our waking thoughts too can gain the same reality as our dreams, if they are only encouraged and defended from outer disturbance. When you sit by the fire in the twilight, there is little to distract your attention, and your thoughts in such reveries seem strangely real. I have heard of people who indulged in such daydreams, carrying them from day to day, retiring to their rooms always at a certain hour, and taking them up where they left the day before, till their life spent in this way seemed as real as their ordinary life. And there are other people, authors of novels or dramatists, who deliberately do this, who deliberately isolate themselves and concentrate their minds, till the figures and characters so created become like living men and women, and not only to themselves but to the world at large. So that today, to every one of us, there are scores of characters created by the great dramatists and authors, of which it is hard for us at the moment to say whether they are men and women whom we actually remember, or whether they are creations from books. The truth being that the author with immense labor has projected his own feeling, his own vitality, into figures and forms with such force that they begin to compete in reality with the figures and forms of the actual world. We may then, I think, fairly conclude from what has been said that the same process may be witnessed both in our waking thoughts and in our dreams, namely, a continual ebullition and birth going on within us, and an evolution out of the mind-stuff of forms, which are the expression and images of underlying feeling. That these forms, at first vague and undetermined in outline, rapidly gather definition and clearness and materiality, and press forward towards expression in the outer world. And we may fairly ask whether we are not here within our own minds, witnessing what is really the essential process of creation, taking place everywhere and at all times, in other persons as well as ourselves, and in the great life which underlies and is the visible universe. But it will be said, we can see that the feelings in man clothe themselves in mental images, which he, by throwing his vitality more and more into them, can make practically real to himself. and which by roundabout processes like writing books or setting workmen to build houses, he can in time body forth and make real to other folk. But ought he not, if your theory be correct, to be able to throw those mental images direct into the outer world, so as to become visible and tangible to others at once and without intermediate operations? To which I answer, don't be in too great a hurry. I believe man has the germ of such power, and will have it in greater degree. But because he can travel so far along the route at present, it does not follow that with his yet undeveloped powers he can at once reach the point of being able to project his thoughts instantly into the world around him. Yet I would like you, in this connection, to consider a few facts. In the first place, is it not true that in moments of great feeling there flashes something out of people's faces and figures, which is visible at once to those around, and which is intensely real, quite as real as a lightning flash, or immovable as a mass of rock? In the second place, has not the modern study of telepathy, by careful and scientific methods, shown pretty conclusively that images can be projected by one mind and be seen or felt by others at a distance? Thirdly, do not the well-established phenomena of wraiths or the ghosts of those in the act of dying point in the same direction, namely, that in such moments the whole vitality of a person may pour itself out towards a loved one and impress itself powerfully as a real presence on the latter's mind? There are other considerations connected with what is called spiritualism, which are very interesting, but which I will not have time to dwell on at any length. There seems a mass of evidence to show that in connection with so-called mediums in a state of trance, images are evolved which become visible and even tangible to a small circle of people. Now, as we have seen that in reverie, when one's body is at rest and the world around one is still, one's vitality may go into one's thoughts to such a degree as to render them strangely real. And as in dreams, when one's body is asleep, the images become more real still, so in trance, which is a still deeper sleep, does it seem quite possible that the inner vitality of the medium may shape itself into images so far material as to be visible even to other folk. At any rate, evidence points in this direction, and the well-known fact that the medium is often greatly exhausted after these manifestations corroborates the idea. For since an author who spends 3 or 4 hours in writing a novel or a play, thus doing some of the hardest work to which a mortal can devote himself, is all the time throwing out his mental vitality to inspire, embody, and create those images which he gives to the world, and in the process, naturally, is intensely exhausted, so by a parity of reasoning, we should expect that the medium out of whose mind stuff such images were directly created would be exhausted in even worse fashion. I may also remind the reader how tiring it is to anyone in ordinary sleep to dream excessively. However, leaving these passing illustrations, I will now proceed along the main line of argument. Whatever we may think about the last few remarks, we do see within ourselves a very distinct process in operation. There is the first birth of dim, vague feeling or desire, then the growth in clearness and intensity of that feeling, then its shaping into distinct thoughts or images, till these latter become intensely real to ourselves. Then the descent of thought and feeling into our nerves and muscles, our habits and manners, the expression of our faces, the very forms of our bodies, and their ultimate translation into action, and the result of our actions in the outer world. Of this process there is no doubt, and thus we see that there is in man a creative thought source, continually in operation, which is shaping and giving form not only to his body, but largely to the world in which he lives. In fact, the houses, the gardens, the streets among which we live, the clothes we wear, the books we read, have been produced from this source. And there is not one of these things, the building in which we are at this moment, the conveyance in which we may ride home, which has not in its first birth been a mere phantom thought in some man's mind, and owes its existence to that fact. Some of us who live in the midst of what we call civilization simply live embedded among the thoughts of other people. We see, hear, and touch those thoughts, and they are for us our world. But no sooner do we arrive at this point and see the position clearly, than another question inevitably rises upon us. If, namely, this world of civilized life, with its great buildings and bridges and wonderful works of art, is the embodiment and materialization of the thoughts of man, how about that other world of the mountains and the trees, and the mighty ocean and the sunset sky, the world of nature? Is that also the embodiment and materialization of the thoughts of other beings, or of one other being? And when we touch these things, are we also coming into touch with the thoughts of these beings? It may seem rather absurd to some folk to suppose that rocks and stones and trees and waterspouts can be the expression of anyone's thoughts, but that does not prove the thing to be impossible. We know that to primitive savages writing, so familiar to us, appears just such an impossible thing. Some time ago I heard a well-authenticated story of a trader up country in a distant land, and among a people utterly unused to civilization, who had each week to send a basket of provisions to another European who lived some miles away. The native who carried the basket was naturally much tempted by the fowls, bread, eggs, or other things that it contained, and on one occasion, being overcome, took some of the food, then covered up the basket and delivered it as usual. But the man who received it took up a little piece of paper, which of course contained a list of the articles from the basket, looked at it, and then said, "You have taken a loaf and so many eggs." The native, horror-struck, confessed his sin and was punished, after which he refrained for some time, but at last gave way again, and of course with the same result. He had a great fear of that little bit of paper. He thought it was fetish, taboo. Not for one instant did it occur to him that those little scratches and dots on it could mean anything, could have any sense. No, he thought, the paper was alive, and that it saw what he did, and told the man. So he determined what to do. The next time he felt hungry, he waited till he came to a lonely spot. Then he put the basket down, took out the bit of paper, not without fear and trembling, carried it off to a distance, and hid it behind a rock, where it could not see him or the basket. Then he helped himself freely, and having done so, smoothed the napkin nicely over the top, put the paper back, and delivered the basket as usual. Alas! It was no use. The paper told all. He was punished again, and from that time he abandoned the affair as hopeless. But if the savage takes a long time to learn that these lines and marks on paper have meaning, may it not also take us a long time to learn that these lines of the sea and sunset sky, these forms and colors of the trees and the flowers, are the expression of ideas waiting perhaps through the ages for their interpreters? It is curious that we admit intelligence in man, though we cannot prove it. I am hopeful that you perceive some intelligence in me, but you cannot absolutely prove that I feel and think. For all you know, I may be merely a cleverly made automaton. You only infer that I feel and think from a comparison of my actions and movements with your own. And so, on the same grounds, we infer intelligence in dogs and monkeys, because their movements still resemble ours in some degree. But we must remember that Descartes and other philosophers have contended that animals were merely machines, or automata without feeling, and certainly one is almost obliged to think that some of our vivisecting professors adopt the same view. When, however, we come to creatures whose movements do not much resemble ours, like worms and oysters and trees, it is noticeable that we become very doubtful as to whether they feel or are conscious. and even disinclined to admit that they are. Yet it is obviously only a question of degree, and if we allow intelligence in our fellow men and women, and then in dogs, horses, and so forth, where and at what particular point are we to draw the line? In fact, it is obvious that the main reason why we do not allow intelligence in an oyster is because we do not understand and interpret its movements as well as we do those of a dog. But it is quite conceivable that to one of its own kind another oyster may appear the most lovely and intelligent being in creation. Certainly it is quite probable that the feeling and consciousness in an oyster or a tree is different and less extended than in a man or a dog, but that in its order and degree it is quite as intense and definite, I hardly doubt. What is it that before all convinces us that there is an intelligent self in our fellow man? It is that he has a will and a purpose, a character, which, do what you will, tends to push outwards towards expression. You put George Fox in prison, you flog and persecute him, but the moment he has a chance he goes and preaches just as before. And so with all of us, our lives, despite all the blows of fortune and misfortune, spring again and again from a mental root which we recognize as our real selves, which we want to express, which we must express, and to express which is our very life. But take a tree, and you notice exactly the same thing. A dominant idea informs the tree of the life, persisting as it forms the tree. You may snip the leaves as much as you like to a certain pattern, but they will only grow in their own shape. You may cut off a branch, and another will take its place. You may remove a small twig, and even that twig will have within it the pervading character or purpose. For if you plant it in the ground, another tree of the same shape will spring from it. Finally, you may cut the tree down, root and branch, and burn it. But if there is left a single seed, within that seed, in an almost invisible point, lurks the formative ideal, which under proper conditions will again spring into life and expression. I need hardly remind you here how exactly similar to that seed is the little compressed desire or need, which at the very beginning of this argument we saw, as it were, lurking in the human breast, and which afterwards, under the proper conditions, grew out into a house or some other great objective result in the external world. Look at the huge network of railways, now like an immense tree with endless branches encircling the globe. Once that tree slept in the form of a little compressed thought, or feeling in the breast of George Stephenson, the collier lad, and unbeknown and invisible to any but himself. And now, at this time of year, there are lying and being buried in the great earth thousands and thousands of millions of seeds of all kinds of plants and trees, which during the long winter will slumber there, like little dream images in the brain of the great globe, waiting for their awakening. And when the spring comes with the needful conditions, they will push forward towards their expression and materialization in the outer world, even as every thought presses towards its manifestation in us. Thus, as we think about it, it becomes more and more possible to see that this solid earth and the great liquid sea, and even the midnight sky with its wonderful starry systems, which from dreamlike nebula have gradually, through the ages, cohered into definite, and one may say living organisms, that this great world of nature, just as much as the world of man, is the panorama of a conscious life, ever pressing forwards towards expression and manifestation. And that these dots and scratches in the writing, these stones and stars and storms, are words appealing to us continually for our loving understanding and interpretation. We conclude the intelligence of our friends because we should find it absurd and impossible to place ourselves on a lonely pinnacle and look upon those we love as automatons. And in the same way, in proportion as we come to love and understand the animals and the trees and the face of nature, we find it impossible to deny intelligence to these. Certainly there are times, as for instance in looking at some beautiful landscape or sunset sky, when not only we seem to perceive, as the Greeks did, separate presences or spirits in the trees and the plants, and the streams, but we seem to feel the overshadowing of a universal mind, quote, a sense sublime, as Wordsworth has it, of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Creation, then, is not an almighty fiat by which things are suddenly out of nothing given form and solidity, or if it is a process of which we have no experience, and which is unintelligible to us. On the other hand, we cannot regard it as a fortuitous concourse of material atoms, because we have no experience of such atoms, or of their existence. And if creation were such a concourse of sensible things, it would be itself senseless and mere nonsense, which it certainly is not. But it is a process, I take it, which we can see at any time going on within our own minds and bodies, by which forms are continually being generated from feeling and desire, and gradually acquiring more and more definition, pass outward from the subtle and invisible into the concrete and tangible. This process, I say, we can observe within ourselves, in the passage from emotion to thought, and from these again to action and the external world. It is the foundation of all human art. The painter, the sculptor, the musician are forever bringing their dreams of beauty and perfection forward, from the most intimate recesses and treasure houses of their hearts, and giving them a place in the world. And not only the artist and musician, but every workman who makes things does the same. The world of man is created by this process, and I have given reasons for supposing that the world of nature is continuous with that of man, and that there are two innumerable beings, are forever laboring to express themselves, and so to enter into touch and communication with each other. The reader may say there is no evidence that man ever produces a particle of matter directly out of himself, and I will admit this is so. But there is plenty of evidence that he produces shapes and forms, and if he produces shapes and forms, that is all we need. For what matter is in the abstract, no one has the least experience or knowledge. All we know is that the things we see are shapes and forms of what we call matter. And if, as is possible and indeed probable, matter is of the same stuff as mind, only seen and envisaged from the opposite side, then the shapes and forms of the actual world are the shapes and forms of innumerable minds, our own and others, thus projected for us mutually, to witness and to understand. However, there I leave the argument. I will only in conclusion say that in this view, creation is a stupendous and perpetually renewed work of art, an everlasting evolution and expression of inner meaning into outer form. Not only in the great whole, but in every tiniest part, nature is a great vehicle, an innumerable network and channel of intelligence and emotion. And this whole domain of the universe, the theater of an immense interchange of conscious life. Countless hosts of living beings, of every grade of organization and consciousness, are giving utterance to themselves, expressing and unfolding that which is within them, even as every child of man, from birth to death, is constantly endeavoring to express and unfold and give utterance to what lies within him. With incredible speed the messages of these intelligences flash through space. The morning stars sing together. The messages of light and sound and electricity and attraction penetrate everywhere, and as modern science shows us that the air, the sea, and the solid frame of the earth itself may be the vehicle of waves, which without wire or definite channel may yet convey our thoughts safely to one another through intervening leagues of distance, so surely we must believe that the countless vibrations ever going on around and ever radiating from and impinging on every known object are messengers, too, of endless meaning and feeling. The intelligences which constitute the universe are doubtless of infinite variety and of infinite gradation in development. Some may find expression in a mere point of space. Others may enclose a planet or a solar system. Some are harmonious and accordant together. Others may be, as we well know, in violent mutual hostility or warfare. Yet, in the end, they are included. To regard the world as simply an arena of separate warring beings and personalities is impossible, because, as all science, philosophy, and experience convince us, there is inevitably a vast unity underlying it all, and all these beings and personalities must root down in one ultimate life and intelligence. All of them, in the end and deep down, must have a common purpose and object of existence. And in that thought there is liberation. In that thought there is rest.